The torches burn low in the courtyard of the Iceni royal compound. Smoke carries the smell of pine resin and cold iron. It is early spring in the province of Britannia, somewhere in the year 60 AD, and the air still holds the frost of a night that has not yet decided to end. Roman soldiers move through the compound with practiced efficiency, not the urgency of battle, but the calm deliberateness of men who have been given permission. Inside the hall, a woman screams, then stops. The soldiers emerge. They carry nothing. They take nothing from the treasury that night. What they have taken cannot be weighed or recovered. Two young women remain on the stone floor of the hall, breathing, but only barely present in the sense that matters. Outside, their mother is held against a post, her back already open, her face still turned toward the door. She has not stopped watching the door. She will not stop watching the door until the soldiers are gone, and when they are, she will begin to plan. This is not a story about a barbarian queen and a failed rebellion. This is the story of what happens when an empire mistakes legal authority for moral permission and pays for that confusion in fire and blood. Historians have long framed Boudicca as a provincial problem solved by Roman military discipline. Tacitus, who recorded these events within living memory of them, understood something his later interpreters have often missed. This revolt did not begin on a battlefield. It began the morning after a door closed, and two girls were left broken on a cold stone floor. Before we walk into the burning ruins of what Rome built in Britain, drop a comment with your city and country, hit subscribe and join Velours Spectre. You are watching Velours Spectre, where history does not sanitize its darkest hours. Every story we tell is one the textbooks buried. This one starts with an injustice so deliberate, so total, that it turned a grieving mother into the most dangerous woman Rome ever underestimated. Britannia in the year 60 AD was not a conquered province so much as a contested one. Rome had held the southern lowlands for nearly 2 decades, but the grip was never comfortable, never clean. The legions had pushed north and west, leaving behind a patchwork of client kingdoms, tribal territories allowed to govern themselves in exchange for cooperation, and the quiet acceptance of Roman supremacy. It was an arrangement Rome had used across the empire, and it worked when Rome kept its end of it. The Iceni tribe occupied the eastern flatlands of what is now Norfolk and Suffolk, a people of farmers, horse breeders, and warriors, ruled by a king named Provincial. He had played the Roman game well. For years he governed as a client king, maintaining peace with the provincial administration in Camulodunum, modern Colchester, while keeping his kingdom functioning. When Provincial died, likely around 60 AD, he left behind what he believed was a carefully constructed settlement. His kingdom divided equally between his 2 daughters and the Emperor Nero, a dual bequest designed to protect his family while satisfying the empire's expectation of inheritance. As historian Miranda Aldhouse Green notes in her study of the Iceni revolt, this kind of dual inheritance was not without precedent in the Roman world. What Provincial failed to account for was the particular appetite of the men Rome had sent to administer Britannia. Decianus Catus, the provincial procurator, had a different reading of the will. Under Roman law, as he chose to apply it, a client king could not bequeath a kingdom to daughters. The kingdom belonged to Rome entirely. The daughters inherited nothing. What followed was not a legal dispute. It was a demonstration. Roman financial agents and soldiers moved into Iceni territory. They seized the estates of the tribal nobility. They treated the royal household not as a sovereign family in mourning, but as the collateral of a debt that had come due. And when the queen objected publicly in the hearing of her people and her daughters, Rome answered her objection in a language that needed no translation. The woman they had flogged was not who they thought she was. Boudicca, her name derived from the Brittonic word for victory, appears in the historical record as a figure of considerable physical presence. Cassius Dio, writing in his Roman history roughly a century after the revolt, describes her as tall, with a harsh voice and a mass of red hair that fell past her waist, wearing a multicolored tunic and a thick cloak fastened with a brooch. He was writing from distance and likely with embellishment, but the image he records, commanding, severe, unmistakable, aligns with what we know of how Iceni queens functioned within their society. Among the Iceni, women could inherit, could lead, could command. Boudicca is not a queen by default or by the absence of a male heir. She had been Provincial's co-ruler in practice, fluent in the political languages of both her tribe and the Roman administration, aware of how the client kingdom arrangement was supposed to function, and aware of the precise moment it had stopped functioning. She understood what Rome was. She had spent years inside the agreement her husband built, learning where the architecture was solid and where it was hollow. The morning after the soldiers left the compound, she was something different. The grievance she now carried was not abstract, not the resentment of a subordinate people under a foreign yoke. It was specific, embodied, and it had been witnessed by every person in her world who mattered. The Iceni had watched their queen be broken in public. Rome had intended this as a conclusion. She intended to make it a beginning. The decision to revolt was not made in anger, or not only in anger. It was made with calculation. Boudicca understood that the moment that had just passed was either a beginning or an ending, and she chose beginning. She moved through the Iceni nobility, meeting with the leaders of neighboring tribes, assembling a coalition from shared humiliation and accumulated grievance. The Trinovantes of what is now Essex joined almost immediately. They had their own wounds, land seized, sons conscripted, grain commandeered to supply the veterans' colony at Camulodunum that had been built on ground taken from them. Other smaller tribes sent fighters. By the time the spring of 60 AD been toward summer, Boudicca commanded a force that ancient sources estimate with varying degrees of reliability in the hundreds of thousands. The precise number is disputed. The direction was not. She chose her first target carefully. Camulodunum was not a military stronghold. It was a statement, a Roman city planted on reclaimed Trinovantian land, anchored by a vast temple to the divine Claudius, broadcasting Roman permanence to every tribal leader in the eastern lowlands. Boudicca intended to answer that broadcast. The timing was precise in its opportunity. The Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinius was campaigning far to the west, on the sacred island of Mona, present-day Anglesey, destroying the Druidic sanctuary there. The Iang Hispana Legion, the nearest Roman military force, was under strength and positioned far to the north. The procurator Decianus Catus sent only 2,000 auxiliary troops to defend Camulodunum. They arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to change anything. Boudicca moved, and what she brought to Camulodunum would, for the first time since Rome arrived in Britannia, make the empire afraid. Camulodunum fell in a day. The retired legionary veterans who had settled there had petitioned Rome for reinforcement and received almost nothing. Tacitus in the Annals records the failure with unusual directness. The city had no proper walls, no defensive perimeter, and its inhabitants, rather than evacuating when they still could, crowded into the temple of Claudius for a final stand. They held for 2 days. Then the Iceni broke through. What happened inside Camulodunum is described by Tacitus and confirmed by archaeology in terms that leave little room for softening. The city was not looted in the conventional Roman sense, stripped of wealth and left standing. It was unmade. Buildings were pulled down. The temple was torched. Every resident who had not escaped was killed. 20th-century archaeologists excavating beneath the modern city of Colchester found what the ancient sources described, a layer of burned red clay running beneath the streets, the scorched remnants of Roman structures preserved in the earth like a scar that has refused to heal. Coins, jewelry, fragments of daily Roman life, all abandoned mid-moment in the instant of flight. The statue of the divine Claudius, the emperor who had launched the British conquest, was decapitated. Its bronze head was thrown into a river. It remained there for nearly 19 centuries, until a farmer recovered it from the River Alday in 1907. It sits in the British Museum today. The eyes still look outward with a permanent, unseeing calm. For Rome, the fall of Camulodunum was more than a military loss. It was a rupture in the idea sustaining the province that Roman civilization once planted was immovable. The Iang Hispana Legion marched south to intercept Boudicca. She destroyed its infantry in open battle, scattered its cavalry, and left its survivors to shelter inside their fort. They did not emerge again to face her. After Camalodunum, the momentum became its own force. Decianus Catus, the procurator who had ordered the seizure of Iceni lands, who had signed the paperwork that sent 2,000 inadequate soldiers to a city that needed 10 times that number, who had authored the chain of decisions that had produced everything now burning across the eastern province, crossed the water to Gaul before Boudicca reached the next city. Rome, recognizing what he represented, quietly allowed him to vanish from the record. Tacitus does not follow him. There is nothing worth following. Londinium was next. In 60 AD it was not yet the administrative capital of Britannia, but it was already its commercial center, a trading city at the tidal limit of the Thames, dense with Roman merchants, financial agents, and the economic infrastructure of an occupying power. Governor Suetonius Paulinus had raced back from Mona the moment he received word of Camalodunum's fall. He arrived in Londinium ahead of Boudicca. He assessed the defenses. He assessed the civilian population, and then he made a decision that historian Vanessa Collingridge, in her biography of Boudicca, identifies as one of the most cold-blooded calculations in the Roman administration of Britain. Suetonius took his cavalry and rode north to regroup with his legions, leaving behind everyone who could not march, the elderly, the sick, the merchants who had built their lives in a city they did not believe would actually fall. Tacitus records that those who remained were held in place by their attachment to the place and their disbelief in the warning. They stayed. They should not have. Boudicca did not pause. Londinium burned. The same band of scorched destruction that archaeologists found beneath Colchester runs beneath the streets of modern London, a thin red layer of burned clay and debris that dates precisely to 60-61 AD. It runs beneath the Bank of England, beneath Grace Church Street, a line of fire in the earth, marking where Boudicca passed through, preserved 2,000 years below the surface of a city that kept being built on top of it. She turned northwest. Verulamium, present-day Stalbans, burned next. 3 cities in sequence, each a node of Roman life in Britannia, each reduced to the same archaeological signature, that thin, datable layer of red. Ancient sources estimate the total Roman death toll across all 3 cities at 70,000, a figure almost certainly inflated, but reflecting a scale of destruction the province had never seen and would not see again. The Roman world was, by this point, genuinely afraid. Nero, according to later sources, considered withdrawing from Britannia entirely. The province had always been expensive, militarily demanding, economically marginal relative to what it cost to hold. The revolt gave those who had always questioned the investment their strongest argument yet. If a single queen, moving through the lowlands with a coalition army, could destroy 3 cities and eliminate a legion's infantry strength in a matter of weeks, what exactly was Rome purchasing with everything it spent here? The answer in the end was pride. An emperor could not be seen abandoning a province to a woman with a grievance. Suetonius Paulinus was given his legions, resupplied, and ordered to finish it. He chose his ground carefully, at a site that to this day remains unidentified somewhere in the Midlands on terrain that gave him a forested rear. And the one thing Boudicca's army had no answer for, the right ground for the way Rome fought. The battle that ended the revolt is described by Tacitus with a specificities, suggesting he spoke to men who had been there, or to men who had spoken to those men. Suetonius chose the ground first. He positioned his approximately 10,000 soldiers, drawn from the Exench Gemina, parts of the Exenx Valeria, and auxiliary cavalry, at the narrow end of a defile, a pass between forested hills that would force any attacking force to compress, to surrender the advantage of width. As it advanced, the trees behind him prevented encirclement. The open plain ahead was where Boudicca's army would have to form, and her army was vast. Ancient sources give numbers ranging from 100,000 to twice that, figures historians treat as literary amplification, but which nonetheless reflect a genuine numerical superiority that by any conventional calculation should have decided the day before it began. What the numbers could not tell her was what the ground would do to them. She had brought her family to watch. This single detail preserved in Tacitus carries a weight that grows the longer you hold it. The wagons carrying the families of the tribal fighters, wives, children, elders were arranged in a wide semicircle at the rear of the army, forming a kind of amphitheater behind the assembled host. They were there to witness what everyone assembled believed was the inevitable conclusion of the campaign. The wagons blocked every exit from the plain behind them. Before the battle, Boudicca addressed her army from a chariot, her daughters beside her. Tacitus reconstructs the speech with the literary conventions of his era. It may not be verbatim, it may be his construction of what she would have said, but it carries the internal logic of what she understood about this moment. She spoke not as a queen demanding territory back, but as a woman enumerating, without softening, what had been taken from her body, and from the bodies of her daughters, and from the body of every person assembled behind her on that plain. She was not asking her army to fight for land. She was asking them to decide one final time whether what had been done to them would be answered or absorbed. The Romans did not charge. They waited. This was Suetonius's calculation. Let the Iceni come down through the narrowing approach, where mass became compression and speed became collapse. When Boudicca's army moved forward, it funneled into the defile. The Roman infantry held in tight wedge formation, the legionaries pressing back against a force that had nowhere to redirect itself. The auxiliary cavalry moved along both flanks, cutting off the edges of the tribal line. The Romans were trained for exactly this. The sustained mechanical pressure of close formation against a mass that could not maneuver, could not breathe, could not use what it had. The Iceni line broke, not at once, irreparably, and then the wagons completed the catastrophe. The fighters who turned to run found the semicircle of family vehicles behind them, blocking the plain, trapping them between the Roman advance and the celebration that had been arranged that morning for a different outcome. Tacitus records the dead at 80,000, almost certainly inflated, certainly including the families who had come to watch. The animals harnessed to the wagons were killed alongside the people. It was not a rout in the way military histories use that word. It was a closing. The geometry of the battlefield simply ran out of room for the living. Boudicca did not survive it. What happened to her in the immediate aftermath is the one question the record refuses to resolve cleanly. Tacitus says she took poison. Cassius Dio says she fell ill and died in the days that followed. Neither account is verifiable. Both agree on the essential point. She was not captured. She was not paraded through Rome. She was not made into a spectacle for the crowds of the Circus Maximus. If she chose the moment and manner of her own ending, it was the last in a long series of choices Rome had forced her to make, and the only one entirely beyond their reach. Her daughters, whose names no ancient source records, vanish from the account at the battle. We do not know what happened to them after the plain. We do not know if they lived. History gave them a role at the beginning of this story and then closed the door. Their mother's name has survived 2,000 years of transmission, translation, and loss. Their names did not. That absence, too, is part of what Rome did to them. The battlefield itself has never been identified. Historians and archaeologists have proposed sites across the English Midlands, Manchester in Warwickshire, High Cross, various points along Watling Street. None has been confirmed. Somewhere beneath English fields, the soil holds what that day produced. It has not been found. Perhaps it will not be. Some accounts belong to the earth longer than they belong to us. What came after the battle was Roman in its thoroughness. Suetonius Paulinus pursued the remaining Iceni through their territory with systematic force. Tacitus records that he burned their lands and stripped their stores of grain, leaving them without the harvest reserves needed to survive the coming winter, a punishment calculated to extend the military victory into a famine. The new procurator sent from Rome, Gaius Julius Alpinus Classicianus, eventually argued against this approach, not from mercy but from accounting. A destroyed province generates no revenue. He was correct. Suetonius was recalled. Classicianus's report to Nero carried the argument. The temple of Claudius was rebuilt in Camulodunum. Londinium grew into the administrative capital Boudicca. Had not quite managed to permanently erase the city she burned, became in subsequent generations the largest Roman city north of the Alps. Roman Britannia continued for another 3.5 centuries after the revolt it had manufactured. Decianus Catus, the procurator who had ordered the initial seizures of Iceni land and property, who had sent the inadequate reinforcement, who had crossed to Gaul before the fire reached Londinium, left no further trace in the historical record. The man who started the war did not stay to see it end. History does not record that anyone went looking for him. What the Boudiccan revolt reveals is something older than Rome and more durable than any single empire. Power systems that treat people as property tend, eventually, to produce the person who refuses the categorization. Boudicca did not become dangerous the moment Roman soldiers entered her compound. She became dangerous the morning after, when she made a decision about what the event meant and what she intended to do about it. The violence she then unleashed was enormous, real, and devastating to many people who had played no part in what had been done to her. That is the nature of what Hannah Arendt might recognize as the cycle of systemic violence. It does not produce clean, proportionate responses. It produces storms. What Rome never understood about Boudicca was the thing it had manufactured, not a rebel, not a provincial nuisance. The precise convergence of capacity, legitimacy, and grief that makes a person capable of holding an empire momentarily still. Rome had built her out of a flogging post, a closed door, and the assumption that the people it categorized as beneath law had no mechanism to answer back. They were wrong about the mechanism. They simply could not see what they had set in motion from the inside of their own permission. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story changed the way you understand what empires do to the people they conquer and what those people are capable of doing in return, subscribe, hit the like button, and share with someone who needs to see it. History remembered Boudicca. It forgot her daughters. We chose not to. You have just watched another premium documentary from Velours Spectre. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. The descent into the past continues.